All right, good morning, everyone. I realized I forgot to put my microphone on. Happy Monday, everyone. So let's try that again. Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday. My name is Sarah. I'm one of the educators here at the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California, and I'm so excited to join you all today, or that you're joining us to talk about what has to be my favorite habitat. Now, a lot of my programs, I'm like, this is my favorite thing to talk about, and I do have a lot of favorites here at the aquarium, but my favorite habitat to talk about and to go explore are the tide pools. So right here, you can see some of the tide pools that we have here at the aquarium, but what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about what this habitat is, what it looks like, how it functions, and then we'll explore some of the animals that live in a tide pool. Now, as we're exploring today, if you have any questions about the tide pool, if you've been to the tide pools and you've seen some animals and you want to share, if you just want to give us a hello, good morning, or a shout out, we have a text line where you can reach us, and I'm going to have Tina put up that text line. I've got a team here in the studio with me. I've got Tina and Jenna, and they're helping control all the things you see here. So you can text us at 562-286-1838. You can text us those questions, observations, thoughts on the tide pool, saying hello and good morning. And that's if you're watching live. So it's Monday morning, August 7th at 9 a.m. Now, if you're watching after the fact, we still want to hear from you. We still want to be able to answer any questions you might have. We just ask that you email us at live@lbaop.org. All right, everyone, are you ready to get started and start exploring? So I'm going to have Tina put up a picture of a real tide pool. And what I mean by real tide pool, I mean out in the open ocean. This one is here at the aquarium, but we have some pictures of tide pools out in the natural world. Now, right here in Southern California, we have a lot of tide pools to explore. There are tide pools in San Pedro, there are tide pools in Palos Verdes, there are tide pools in Malibu, and then going the other direction, there are tide pools in Huntington and in Laguna. So all along our coast, there are tide pools. But let's take a moment and break it down. What does this word tide pool, or what does this habitat look like? What does it mean to be a tide pool? So here's a picture, and let's start to make some observations. What do you notice about this habitat? What kinds of things do you see? Now, every tide pool is going to look a little bit different, but there are some key sort of points or parts of that habitat that you'll see at all of them, regardless of where you are. Any tide pool is going to have a couple things, even though they might look a little bit different. So this is a picture of one tide pool. Now, we're going to pause a moment on this picture, and we're going to go over to my document camera, because I like to kind of break down this word. So I'm going to write tide pool. Now, there's basically two words in this word tide pool. We've got tide and pool. I like to start with pool. That's an easier word. When you think of a pool, you might think of a swimming pool. Maybe you have one in your backyard, or you visit one in your community, or maybe a friend has one. When you think of a pool, there are two things that make up that pool. Can you think of those two things? One of them? Water. Of course, right? For a pool, you need water. Now, the second thing you need for a pool is, if you think of like a pool in your community or your backyard, there's probably some sort of rock structure, concrete, that holds it all together. But basically, you need something to contain or to hold the water. So, some space for the water to go. If you just drop water on the ground, it's not going to stay in one space. It's going to kind of spread out. So you need something to contain that water. So that's what you need for a pool. You need water, and you need a space to contain it. So we need water and a container. Now, tide, that one's a little bit trickier. You might think of tide maybe has to do with your laundry, like your parents, or maybe you do your laundry and you use Tide. I use Tide. But that's not the type of tide we are talking about. We are talking about tides in the ocean. So what do you think tides have to do with? I'll draw you a little hint. It has to do with the waves, and it connects to the water. It has to do with the water. So the tides are the waves that come crashing in to the shore, and it's the changing of those waves. So every day we have two high tides where the water gets really high, and then we have two low tides where the water is pretty low. Now, if we combine those two, tide and pool, we get this area where there's lots of rocks, and when the high tide comes, the water covers those rocks. And when the low tide comes, the water recedes or it goes back out, and the water gets caught in those spaces of the rocks, right? That's the container. And in those sort of containers of rocks, those spaces where the water gets caught, we end up finding lots of animals. So let's go back to our picture of the tide pool. And you can see we've got a lot of rocks here. And we've got the water here. And over here, the rocks are exposed. So we can take a guess, we can make a hypothesis that this is a lower tide, because if it was high tide, the water would be completely covering these rocks here. But at a low tide, when the water goes back out, we can see in all these spaces here and even all the way over here and right here that the water got caught in those spaces when it went back out, and that creates those little pools for animals to live in. So we have high tide and low tide. Now I'm going to draw a quick picture back to my document camera. So here are the rocks. And then we've got the water. And then I'm going to draw me at the tide pool because I said I love to visit the tide pool. Very happy to be here. And I come here in the morning. Now, do you think this is high tide or low tide? You can raise your hands really, really high if you think it's high tide, and put your hands really, really low if it's low tide. You can whisper high tide or low tide. You can raise your hand if you are in a class and share with your teacher or with another classmate. Do you think this is high tide or low tide? All right, on the count of 3, we're going to share our thoughts. Ready? 1, 2, 3. That's right. It's high tide. And we can tell it's high tide because all this rock work here is covered by the water. Now, I'm hanging out at the tide pool, and then I get a little hungry, so I go have a snack. Maybe some crackers and cheese or some goldfish. Maybe a nectarine. I was eating a nectarine earlier today. So I have a snack, and then I come back a little bit later in the day. The water is not still going to be here. It's going to have changed. Like I said, there's 2 high tides a day and 2 low tides a day. Now, do you predict the water is going to go even higher or lower? What do we think? Excellent. That water is not going to go higher because we're already at high tide. It's going to go down here and be low tide. And then all that water gets caught in these spaces here. And that is where we get the tide pools, and all these animals are living in these spaces. Now, tide pools are a really cool place to visit because they're right here along our coastline. At a lot of beaches, you can walk right out onto the rocks and see these animals. It's really easy to access these places. But for these animals, it is one of the toughest places to live. Now let's think for a moment. Why do you think it might be tough for animals to live in these spaces here? Any ideas? Think of what challenges animals in this habitat might face. Let's take a look at another picture of a tide pool. And let's think about some challenges these animals might face. So the water changes. Look at the space. So look at here. We've got the sun is shining. We've got the water out there. Remember, you can go ahead and text us if you have any ideas at 562-286-1838. Because there's a lot of challenges to the animals living here. Now, I said it's sunny out. And imagine right now, in the middle of the summer, it's really hot out here, especially in Long Beach. It gets to like the high 80s, and it's humid, and it's not very comfortable for us. And imagine these animals are in these tiny little pools like right here, and the sun is shining down. It could warm the water, or if an animal gets stuck on a rock when the water goes back out, that animal might dry out. So that's a challenge, is the heat and not being in the water. Now, also, when the water is shallow and these areas are exposed, there's a lot of other animals who might be flying around, maybe some birds. Or at one of the tide pools that I like to go to in San Pedro, there are possums, there are raccoons, there are even foxes that live in that area. And they actually wait for those low tides. They know when the low tide is coming, and they wait for that low tide, and then they go have a snack. They feast on all those little animals living in the tide pools. Think about it in the tide pool even. You might be stuck in a tide pool with another animal who maybe is a predator to you. So you might be stuck in a place where it's not so safe. So there's a lot of challenges. And then on top of all of those challenges, we've got the water, right? Look back here. You can see the waves. These waves can be really strong. Now I want you to think for a moment and raise your hand if you've been to the beach before. I have. Well, I bet a lot of you have been to the beach. Okay, now I want you to think when you went to the beach, raise your hand if you went in the water. Definitely me too. Okay, one more time. Think when you went in the water. Raise your hand if you got knocked over by a wave. I bet everyone who's raised their hand that they went in the water, I bet you've all been knocked over by a wave. I know I have. Even though we're strong people and we can stand as still as we can and stiff, those waves can be really, really strong and they can knock us over. So think about it. These little animals in these areas, look at these waves. Now, they don't look very big, but they have a lot of power, a lot of force behind them. So think about if we get knocked over, do you think the animals who live in this habitat want to get knocked over or knocked off a rock? Do you think for an animal who lives in a little pool like here is safe out here? Definitely not. So these animals, they have to deal with all that wave action too. Now, as humans, we might try and stand really still. We might try and grip our feet into the sand, or we could hold onto a rock. But eventually, being hit by waves over and over and over again, we might let go. Now, these animals, they don't want to let go. We can just leave the ocean, but they can't. So these animals, they have special adaptations on their body. Now, this is a word we talk about a lot here at the aquarium. If you've watched any programs with us before, even in school, you may have heard this word, adaptation, right here. Now, an adaptation is something on an animal's body that helps it live in its habitat. So every animal you can think of, if you walk around your school or your community or your house and you see any animals, they have at least one, but probably more adaptations that help them live in their habitat. So to help us understand this term a little bit, I want you to think for a moment of a giraffe. Now, I know there's no giraffes in the ocean, but think about a giraffe for a moment. Can you picture it in your brain? Excellent. Now think about what is special about a giraffe that's different from most other animals. You're right, their neck. They have that really long neck, and that neck allows them to eat leaves at the top of the trees that no other animals can reach. So in a place where there's maybe not a lot of leaves to eat, the giraffes, they get their own food source because they have that long neck. So that long neck is an adaptation. It's something on the animal's body that helps it survive in its habitat. Now think for a moment about a monkey. Can you picture a monkey in your brain? Excellent. What is a monkey's adaptation? They have a couple of them. Did you say its hands and its feet? And it has a tail too, right? So it can use its hands to climb, it can use its feet to climb, and it can use its tail. It's like a fifth limb to help it climb. Monkeys also have thumbs like us, right? And our thumbs help us do a lot of things. So even as humans, we have adaptations too. We have things on our body that help us survive in our habitat. Now, animals in the tide pool, they have a ton of adaptations, special ways to stay safe in that habitat from those waves, from the heat, from predators. So we're going to explore for the next couple minutes or the next rest of our program, we're going to explore some of the adaptations that the animals in the tide pool might use to stay safe. So let's go back to one of the tide pools here at the aquarium. All right, let's take a moment and make some observations. What animals do we notice? Do we recognize any of the animals? Have you seen them before, either at an aquarium or maybe you've seen them out in the tide pools? There are lots of really cool animals here, and all of these animals, they have special adaptations, special things on their body that help them survive all those challenges we talked about living in the tide pool. Now, some of them might have the same adaptation. Some of them might have different ones, but they all use those special things on their body to help them stay safe. So let's start off with one that I bet you recognize. Let's start off with this thing right here. You recognize this animal? There's another one over here, and over here, and across the way. Let's take a look at a sea star. Excellent. So sea stars are an animal that we see in the tide pools. We can see sea stars elsewhere in the ocean, but they tend to live on rocky surfaces. As you can see here in this picture, there are rocks underneath. Now, one of the reasons they live on the rocks is because their adaptation, the way they stay safe and hold on, is on the bottom of the sea star. So let's see if we can take a look at the bottom of our sea star and spot how they can stay safe from being hit by those waves over and over and over again. So sea stars, their body is pretty flat, right? You can make your body into a sea star, our arms out, our legs out, and then our head can be the fifth arm, right? They're shaped like a star. And when we see sea stars, their body is pretty flat, right? They're not sticking up really high in the water, but their body is pretty flat. And if you've ever touched a sea star, you would know, and I could tell you from experience, sea stars have a pretty hard body. Now, they're part of a group of animals called invertebrates. So they actually have no bones in their body, but they do have these hard plates that make up their body. Now, being a flat animal with a really hard body, when they get hit by the waves, it doesn't hurt their body as much, right? If we stand in a wave, because we're really tall, we could easily get knocked over because we've got all this space to be hit. But our sea stars, they're pretty flat. So when they get hit by waves, it doesn't really hurt their body that much. And then on top of that, they have these special feet right here. They're called tube feet. Now, not 2 feet. They've got way more than 2, but tube, T-U-B-E, tube feet. And those tube feet are one of their adaptations. Now, tube feet, they're really basically suction cups. And suction cups, they stick onto things really well. And so sea stars have tons of these tiny little feet all along their arms that help them stick on to a surface. So in this picture, you can see the sea star is sticking on to, well, it's kind of hard to tell, but it's sticking onto glass. So this is in one of the exhibits here at the aquarium, and they're using all of those sticky feet. You can see them kind of sticking out right here, and then all these little circle polka dots, and right here, and right here, and here. Oh, here's a good shot at some of them. These are all part of their suction cups that help them to stick onto surfaces. And this helps them hold on really, really tight in case a wave hits them. They don't move very much. Now, those tube feet, they also help them do a couple other things. So this adaptation of having these suction cup feet helps them stay in place, but it also helps them do some other things. So think about, if these are their feet, what else might they help them do besides holding on? What do your feet help you do? That's right, we walk on our feet, right? It helps us move. And so sea stars, they'll use their suction cup feet to help them move as well. And this is where the tube part comes in. So all of these feet are like a little tube. I think they kind of look like macaroni noodles, kind of straight macaroni noodles, but they're like a little tube, and what happens is water will flow through one of them, and then we'll reach that end, the little suction cup that we saw at the end. I think we're going to get a video of them moving their suction cup feet. So their water will flow through that tube and create a seal at the very end. And then they'll fill the next tube with water and release water from this one so they can stick this one. And then this one over here will fill with water and create a seal, and this one will be lifted. And that's how they can move along. Excellent. So take a look. This is a pretty cool video. I actually took this video. So this is a sea star walking here at the aquarium, and you can see all of their feet. See, they kind of look like noodles. And the little sort of round thing in the end is the suction that's going to seal as they're moving along. So these tube feet, they're not only used for holding the sea star in place and staying safe, they're also helpful for helping the sea star to move, right? They might need to move to go to a different place if the place they're sitting is not very comfortable for them, to move away from predators, although sea stars don't have very many predators and they don't move very fast. So they're not going to do a very good job of getting away from a predator. But it also helps them to find or move towards their food. Now, their feet also help them find their food. Now, that might sound kind of silly. Their feet help them find their food. Now, a little thing about sea stars is they don't see very well. They don't have eyes like us. They have something called eye spots at the very end of their arm. But really, they can just see light and dark. They can't really see anything else. No detail, no real shapes, just light and dark. So if they can't find their food by seeing it, they have to use another one of their senses. So what other senses can we use to find something? We can feel for it, but if our sea star is feeling for their food, they've already found it. What if they're going in the wrong direction? They'll never feel for it. So what sea stars do is they actually smell for their food. Now, they don't have a nose like us, but the way that they are able to smell is using, you guessed it, their feet. So they use those suction cup feet to smell for their food. So they have little smell sensors on the bottom of those suction cup feet, and that helps them to smell for their food. So their favorite food must smell really good, right? You would think. But it probably doesn't smell very good to us, but it smells good to them. Sea stars like to eat things like mussels and clams, which are shelled animals. And they don't really want the shell. They want the squishy animal that lives on the inside. So think about it. Let's take a look at a picture of a sea star again. This animal, these sea stars, they're going to be eating shelled things. Like if you look over here, we've got some discarded shells, and these could have been snacks for the sea stars. But you can see the shell is open and the food is not inside there anymore. These sea stars, they want the thing on the inside. But how do you think they're able to get to the inside? Now here at the aquarium, I will tell you, we give them food with the shell already open, so it makes it really easy for them. But in the ocean, these sea stars are not getting food handed to them the way they are here at the aquarium. So how do you think a sea star is able to eat a hard-shelled animal? This animal has 2 shells, and it stays closed as much as it can. You can make your hands into a mussel or a clam. They would open and close and there's a squishy animal on the inside. But if a clam or a mussel knows that a sea star is coming, they're going to stay shut as long as they possibly can. So how do you think the sea star is able to get to the inside of that clam or that mussel? Do you think they use an adaptation? Absolutely. The same adaptation we have been talking about. Sea stars are going to use those suction cup feet. Now what they do is they're going to smell for their food, right? They're going to use those suction cup feet to smell for their favorite food. And then when they get to the clam or the mussel, they are going to give it a giant hug. Do you hug your food before you eat it? Sometimes you might be so excited to eat, you might hug your food or you want to, but that could make a big mess if we squeeze our food. But sea stars, they're going to take their arms with all those sticky suction cups and they're going to wrap them all the way around that clam or that mussel. Now, it's not a nice hug. They're not saying, "Oh, I love you, Mr. Mussel." Instead, once they hug it, they're then going to pull. And those arms can be really strong with all those sticky feet, and they're going to pull and pull and pull and pull until they get that clam or that mussel, the shells, open so that they can get to the animal on the inside. Now, we're going to keep going with how a sea star eats because it's a very different way from the way we eat. So once the sea star has that shell open, they want to get that squishy animal on the inside. But they're not just going to pull it out, right? That might make sense to use one of those sticky arms to pull out their food. That's not how they do it. Instead, what a sea star does is they're actually going to take their stomach and they pull it out of their body. You heard that right. They take their stomach and they pull it out of their body. Right here, you can see a sea star. This is a bat star up against a window here at the aquarium, and they've got their stomach hanging out. That is their stomach. Now, it's kind of squished up against this window, but it kind of looks like little balloons. But what the sea star does is they pull their stomach out of their body, they stuff it into that shell or around whatever animal they're eating, and their stomach has acid in it. Now, acid might sound kind of alarming, but acid is really helpful. We actually have acid in our stomach, and it helps to break down our food. So the sea star is going to put their stomach into that mussel or that clam or whatever they're eating. We feed our sea star shrimp here. We feed them pieces of fish, clam, lots of different things. So they're going to use their stomach with all that acid to break down whatever it is they're eating, and then they'll pull their stomach back into their body. Does that sound kind of silly? Definitely not how we eat, right? You're not going to go have lunch later by opening your lunchbox, pulling your stomach out, putting it into your lunchbox, closing it, shaking it up, and then opening it and slurping it up again. Definitely not. We would make a big mess if we even tried. But this is how our sea stars eat. They're able to remove their stomach from their body, break down their food, and pull it back into their body. There's not a lot to their body, so there's not a lot of space for them to kind of open their mouth and pull their food in. So they basically digest it partially out of their body. And here we've got another good look at those tube feet that serves as their adaptation for holding on tight, for staying safe, for moving, for smelling for their food, and for starting to eat their food. So those tube feet work for a lot of different ways to help the sea star survive by staying safe, by finding food, by eating, all the things that we need to survive. All right, let's take a look at another animal in the tide pool. Let's go back to one of our tide pools here. And let's take a look at another animal. There's lots of other things that we can see here. Now, I'll tell you that a lot of these animals have those sticky feet. Sea stars have those sticky feet. Oop, too far. Sea stars. This animal right here, sitting on top of a sea star, this is called a sea cucumber. And it's actually a relative of a sea star. They also have sticky feet. There's also this animal all the way over here, this spiky one. This is called a sea urchin. A sea urchin is also a relative of a sea star, and they also have those sticky tube feet to help them stay safe. So those tube feet for all of those animals, sea stars, sea cucumbers, sea urchins, help them to hold on. So if a wave comes, it doesn't take them out of their habitat. It helps them to move. That's how they can crawl. It also helps them to smell and find their food. But let's talk about this animal right here, because this one is a little bit different and has some different adaptations. Have you seen that animal before? Ta-da! Do you recognize it? This one is called a sea anemone. Now, you might get urchins and anemones confused. That is very, very common. They both live in the tide pools. One is spiky and one has these tentacles. Anemones are the tentacled ones. Sea urchins are the spiky ones. Totally fine if you get them confused. It is very common to hear them kind of flip-flop names. But they're pretty different animals. Those sea urchins, those purple spiky ones before, had those spikes and the suction gut feet. But this animal, our sea anemone, has a little bit different adaptation. Now, when we talked about the sea stars, I mentioned how their body is pretty flat, right? Their body is flat and has all these hard plates, so if they get hit by a wave, it doesn't really hurt their body very much. Now, our anemone It's kind of hard to tell from this picture, but you can tell it's got more of a stalk to its body. I don't know if we have a picture sort of looking at it from an angle. We can see that their body is a lot taller than a sea star's flat body. But this animal is also part of that invertebrate family, which means that it doesn't have any bones. And unlike the sea star, which has hard plates on its body, the anemone is all soft and squishy. There's nothing hard in its body. And so think about, if you're flat, oh, here we go, you can see this length of the body. Now this anemone is kind of opening up, but you can see it's a lot taller. It's definitely not flat. So the flat animal has a hard body, gets hit by those waves, right? And I mentioned how when we're tall, we can get hit by the waves and it can knock us over. So the anemone that is a little bit taller is all soft and squishy. And so when it gets hit by a wave, it can just kind of wiggle its body and it doesn't hurt it the way that it might hurt us or a sea star if it was a lot taller. So the anemone has a taller body, but because they are very flexible, they're very soft and squishy, they're able to move with the waves rather than staying really still and it hurting their body. Now, this anemone is pretty cool. It's opening up its tentacles. And that's another one of their adaptations, are their tentacles. Now, those tentacles can do something really important and really special. And to give you a hint, they are related to jellies, to sea jellies. So think about, what do jellies do to protect themselves or to catch their food? Have you heard what jellies can do? That's right, jellies can sting. So jellies have these stinging tentacles, and anemones, they have stinging tentacles too. So all of these wiggly tentacles here all around their body, they have stinging cells inside. Now, if you've ever been to our aquarium or another aquarium and you've touched an anemone, you might have felt that it's pretty sticky. Now, the anemones, their sting is not strong enough to hurt us, especially because we have a lot of layers of skin. But when it feels sticky, we know it's actually trying to sting us. That stinger is firing, and they're trying to figure out if we are something that might hurt them or if we're a snack, something that they may want to eat. Because they're going to use those tentacles to stay safe and to catch their food. Now, sometimes when anemones are open, they almost look like a plant or a flower. So we call them flower or plant-like animals because that's kind of what they look like. And animals in the ocean, like a fish or a shrimp that's kind of swimming through the tide pool, may not be able to tell that this is an anemone. They might just think, oh, that's a plant. I'm going to swim right through it. But what they don't know is those tentacles, those sticky tentacles, are going to grab a hold of whatever's swimming through and likely eat it. And their mouth is in the very, very middle. Let's go back to that other picture of an anemone. Now, this is a cool anemone. This one is called a fish-eating anemone. Any guesses what it likes to eat? I'm just playing. That's right. It's in the name. They like to eat fish. Now, other anemones, they'll eat other little shrimp or whatever plankton, whatever floating things kind of come through that tide pool. I've even seen an anemone eating a sea star. Now, I don't think most anemones hunt or go after sea stars. I mean, they don't really move at all. We think that the sea star kind of fell into the mouth of the anemone, which is right here in the very middle. Kind of looks like a belly button. So we think that the sea star just kind of fell in, and the anemone was like, you're already here. I guess I'll eat you. But for the most part, they're eating softer things with more meat on them. Shrimp, whatever other plankton, even fish, like the fish-eating anemone. So a fish might swim through these tentacles, and then the anemone uses those tentacles to sting and grab a hold of that fish, and then they're going to bring it into their mouth. Now, in that video before, we saw that anemone all curled in. That's one way they can stay safe. They can curl in their tentacles, and they don't look like anything. And especially when anemones are caught out of the water, if you've ever been to the tide pool, sometimes you'll see a bunch of anemones on a rock, and they're not in the water anymore. And what they do is they pull all those tentacles in, and they hold water in their body. If you poke them really gently, don't poke them hard, but if you press them really gently, sometimes they spit a little water out at you. That's to say, don't come near me, don't bother me, I'm holding water and I'm waiting for the tide to come back in. As long as we're gentle, it's okay to touch these animals out of the water. But they'll pull their tentacles in to stay safe, or they could be eating. So when they're going to eat their food, they're going to pull their tentacles in because they're bringing the food into their mouth, and that is how they're able to digest their food. Excellent. We are already out of time. I could keep talking about the tide pools. As I mentioned before, it is one of my favorite habitats. But we are about out of time. Let's go back to a tide pool, either out in, there we go, here at the aquarium. So we've got a lot of animals you can explore. And like I said, tide pools are one of our local habitats here in Southern California. So if you're looking for something to do, I would highly recommend going and exploring the tide pools. Now, before we say goodbye and before I send you off to the tide pools, a couple things to keep in mind before you go exploring. One, if you go to the tide pools, you're going to want to make sure you're wearing nice, sturdy shoes. there's lots of rocks, and the water has covered those rocks. It could be sunny. There's a lot of algae or mosses or greens growing on those rocks. So you want to make sure you're really careful you don't slip and fall. So sturdy shoes are really important. Hat, sunscreen, water, all those things you would take if you're exploring any other habitat are important. But another thing to make sure you look at before you go to the tide pool is a tide chart. Now, if you're wondering what the world is a tide chart, that is going to tell you what the tides are. Because even though there are 2 high tides and 2 low tides a day, they're arranged in different levels of how high and how low. And you want to look for the lowest number you can find. So any 0.0 or even a negative number is a really good low tide. So like a negative 1.4 would be an excellent low tide to go see. And the way to find a tide chart is you can just Google tide chart in your area, take a look at when there's a low tide, and those are the best times to go exploring. All right, everyone, I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit about my favorite habitat, and maybe now you'll get a chance to go explore it out in the natural habitat. All right, everyone, we'll see you later. Have a good one.